Operation Barbarossa, the invasion that doomed Germany 3 million soldiers, 3,000 tanks, 2,500 aircraft, and a plan that assumed the Soviet Union would collapse in 8 weeks. It took less than 6 months for that plan to become a death sentence for 4 million German soldiers. On June 22, 1941, at 3:15 in the morning, the largest invasion force ever assembled crossed the Soviet border. The front stretched 2,900 kilometers, from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Hitler called it Operation Barbarossa. He expected victory before winter. The opening week seemed to prove him right. German panzers tore through Soviet defenses like they didn't exist. At Białystok, Minsk, 2 entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed in days. At Smolensk, another 200,000 soldiers surrendered. By September, German forces had pulled off the largest encirclement in military history at Kiev. 600,000 Soviet troops captured in a single operation. In 6 months, the Wehrmacht captured over 3 million Soviet prisoners of war. Here's what happened to them. They were marched into open fields, no shelters, no food, no medical care. German planners hadn't prepared to feed them because feeding them was never the plan. They were meant to die. And they did. From starvation, exposure, typhus, and systematic neglect. By the end of the war, 3.3 million Soviet POWs had died in German captivity. That's a 57% death rate, more than half, exposed in fields, starving in camps, dying by policy, not by accident. But here's what German commanders didn't understand. The Soviet Union could lose 3 million men and still have more. Every destroyed army was replaced. Every encirclement was followed by another defense line. German supply lines stretched over 1,000 kilometers with no winter preparations. By December, Wehrmacht soldiers were wrapping newspaper around their legs because they had no winter clothing. Equipment froze solid. Engines wouldn't start. Frostbite killed 15,000 German soldiers in December alone. The Blitzkrieg that conquered France in 6 weeks choked and died in the Russian snow. Operation Barbarossa captured more territory than any offensive in history. It also guaranteed Germany would lose the war. Because now, with German forces freezing outside Moscow, the Soviets weren't just defending anymore. They were about to attack. Battle of Moscow. When Blitzkrieg failed. A German soldier described what he found when his unit retook a position near Moscow. All the wounded had had their heads split open with short infantry blades. When you see your wounded friend has been brutally killed like that, you understand. This is not a normal war. He was right. The Eastern Front had no rules, no mercy, no limits. And at Moscow, Germany was about to learn what that meant. By late September 1941, German High Command launched Operation Typhoon, the final push to end the war. 1.9 million German troops against 1.2 million Soviet defenders. 2 more massive encirclements at Vyazma and Bryansk added another 600,000 Soviet prisoners to the count. By October, German scouts were just 27 kilometers from the Kremlin. Soviet government ministries began evacuating. Stalin stayed. Then came the Rasputitsa, the season of mud. Autumn rains turned Russian roads into rivers of thick, sucking mud. Tanks sank to their turrets, trucks drowned, horses collapsed and died in the muck. The German advance slowed to a crawl, then stopped completely. The Soviets used every hour. Fresh divisions arrived from Siberia, men trained to fight at -40 degrees, equipped with winter gear, white camouflage, and skis. They had been held back for months, waiting for this moment. On December 5, 1941, with temperatures at -30, they attacked. German soldiers, still wearing summer uniforms, frostbitten, exhausted, out of ammunition, faced waves of Siberian troops emerging from frozen forests like ghosts. The Wehrmacht retreated for the first time in the war. They fell back 100 to 250 kilometers before the front stabilized. The cost was staggering on both sides. Soviet casualties at Moscow reached somewhere between 650,000 and over 1 million dead, wounded, and captured in a single battle. That's roughly equal to total American deaths in all of World War II, military and civilian combined. But the Germans lost something they couldn't count in numbers. They lost the myth. The Wehrmacht was not invincible. They could bleed. They could freeze. They could run. Moscow proved Germany could be beaten. But while the world watched the battle for the capital, another nightmare was unfolding 700 kilometers to the northwest. An entire city was being starved to death. Siege of Leningrad. War by starvation. In the first 6 months of 1942, Leningrad police recorded 1,216 murders committed over ration cards. People killed their neighbors for bread. And that wasn't even the worst of it. The siege began on September 8, 1941, when German and Finnish forces completed their encirclement of Leningrad. 3 million people were now trapped. Hitler had no intention of capturing the city. His orders were explicit. Leningrad was to be erased, starved out of existence. He didn't want prisoners. He didn't want surrender. He wanted the population to die. They nearly did. German bombers destroyed the city's main food warehouses in the opening days. Within weeks, rations were slashed. By November, civilians received 125 grams of bread per day, 3 thin slices. The bread itself was stretched with sawdust, cellulose, and wallpaper paste. There was nothing else. No meat, no vegetables, no fat. Just 125 grams of something that was barely bread. One survivor recalled it simply, "Bread in those days was like gold." People ate anything: wallpaper paste, leather belts boiled into jelly, glue. Pets disappeared first, then the rats. When those were gone, people began to disappear too, and not just from starvation. Soviet authorities formed special police units to combat cannibalism. It wasn't rare. It wasn't isolated incidents. It was happening across the city. Parents ate children. Neighbors ate neighbors. Corpses were found with flesh cut away. The official records acknowledge over 2,000 arrests for cannibalism during the siege. The real number was certainly higher. At the worst point, 1,500 people died every single day. Bodies piled in the streets faster than anyone could bury them. Entire apartment blocks went silent. The only supply route was across frozen Lake Ladoga, the road of life. Trucks drove across ice that cracked and groaned beneath them, under constant German bombardment. When the ice was too thin, drivers kept their doors open and accelerated, ready to jump if the truck broke through. Many didn't make it. Trucks and drivers disappeared into the black water, but enough got through to keep the city barely alive. The siege lasted 872 days, nearly 2.5 years. Between 800,000 and 1 million civilians died, most from starvation. Some estimates put the total death toll, military and civilian, as high as 1.5 million. It remains the deadliest siege in human history. Leningrad never fell. The people died, but the city held, and Hitler still wasn't satisfied. In the summer of 1942, while Leningrad starved, German attention turned south, to a city on the Volga that would become the graveyard of an entire army. Battle of Stalingrad, the point of no return. The average life expectancy of a Soviet soldier arriving at Stalingrad was 24 hours. For officers, it was 3 days. They kept coming anyway, and they held. The German summer offensive of 1942, Case Blue, aimed at the oil fields of the Caucasus. Stalingrad was supposed to be a secondary objective, a city to be neutralized on the way to the real prize. But the city bore Stalin's name. For Hitler, that made it personal. What started as strategy became obsession. German forces reached Stalingrad in late August 1942. What followed was 5 months of the most savage urban combat in history. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, rat war. Fighting happened room to room, floor to floor, staircase to staircase. Men killed each other with bayonets, entrenching tools and bare hands in the rubble of apartment blocks. A single building, the 4-story Pavlov's house, was defended by a platoon of Soviet soldiers for 60 days against continuous German assault. They turned the basement into a fortress and fought off tanks with grenades and rifles. Soviet commander Vasily Chuikov gave one order: hug the enemy. Keep the front lines so close, sometimes just meters apart, that German aircraft and artillery couldn't fire without hitting their own troops. Factories changed hands multiple times in a single day. One grain elevator was contested for weeks. The defenders ran out of water and drank machine oil to survive. On November 19, 1942, the Soviets sprung the trap. Operation Uranus, a massive pincer movement north and south of the city, slammed into the weakly defended Romanian and Hungarian flanks. Within 4 days, the entire German 6th Army was encircled. 300,000 men trapped in a frozen pocket. Hitler refused to allow a breakout. He promised Hermann Göring's Luftwaffe would supply the army by air. The Sixth Army needed 700 tons of supplies per day to survive. On the best days, the Luftwaffe delivered 120. Most days, far less. The army starved. Horses were eaten first, then rats, then leather equipment. Soldiers gnawed on frozen bones. The wounded were left to die because there was nothing to treat them with. Temperatures dropped to -30. Men froze in their foxholes. On January 31st, 1943, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus surrendered, becoming the first German field marshal ever captured alive. Soviet Sergeant Anatoly Mereshko watched Paulus being driven away. He later recalled, "The general who killed so many people just sitting there in the car as if nothing happened." Mereshko raised his rifle. He nearly shot him on the spot. 91,000 German soldiers marched into Soviet captivity. Fewer than 6,000 ever came home. The rest died in prison camps, from starvation, disease, exhaustion, and the same systematic neglect their army had inflicted on Soviet POWs 2 years earlier. Stalingrad broke the German army, not just the Sixth Army, all of it. The strategic initiative shifted permanently to the Soviet Union. Germany would never launch another successful offensive in the East. After Stalingrad, German commanders knew they couldn't win the war, but they believed they could still force a stalemate. With one massive armored blow to regain the initiative, they were about to be proven catastrophically wrong. Battle of Kursk. Germany loses the initiative forever. The Soviet 29th Tank Corps lost 60% of its armor in a single day at Prokhorovka. Burned-out hulks of T-34s littered the fields. Smoke blotted out the sun. And they still won. That's what Kursk looked like. Industrial slaughter. And when the smoke cleared, Germany's capacity for offensive warfare was finished forever. After Stalingrad, a massive Soviet salient bulged westward around the city of Kursk. German planners saw their last opportunity, cut off the salient, encircle the Soviet forces inside, and prove the Wehrmacht could still win. They called it Operation Citadel. It would be the last major German offensive on the Eastern Front. The Germans assembled everything they had left. Nearly 3,000 tanks, including the new Panthers and Tigers, 10,000 artillery pieces, almost 2,000 aircraft, 900,000 men. This was the final bet, but the Soviets knew it was coming. Soviet intelligence had penetrated German planning at the highest levels. For months before the attack, the Red Army prepared the most elaborate defensive system of the war. 8 defensive belts stretching 150 kilometers deep. Over 500,000 mines, so many that German tanks detonated them just trying to reach the start line. Anti-tank guns grouped in fortified strongpoints with interlocking fields of fire. Every road was zeroed. Every approach was a kill zone. When the German offensive finally launched on July 5, 1943, it drove straight into a wall of fire. Progress was measured in meters. Tanks were destroyed faster than they could advance. The new Panthers, Germany's technological hope, suffered catastrophic mechanical failures. Transmissions shattered, engines burst into flames. Dozens of tanks broke down before ever reaching combat. On July 12th, at Prokhorovka, Soviet commander Pavel Rotmistrov threw his entire 5th Guards tank army directly into the German advance. Nearly 1,000 tanks clashed at point-blank range in an area just a few kilometers wide. Dust and smoke reduced visibility to nothing. Tanks rammed each other. Crews fought on foot between burning vehicles. Rotmistrov later admitted his forces failed to accomplish the assigned mission. Soviet losses were enormous, but the German advance stopped. Dead. Within a week, Hitler called off the offensive. Operation Citadel was over. The Soviets immediately launched their own counterattacks and never stopped advancing until they reached Berlin. Kursk proved something the Germans had refused to accept. The Soviet Army of 1943 was not the Soviet Army of 1941. They had learned. They had adapted. They had more tanks, more guns, more men, and now better tactics. From Kursk forward, the Wehrmacht could only do one thing: retreat. And what came next would make even Stalingrad look small. Operation Bagration, the forgotten annihilation. German soldier Heinz Fiedler remembered the moment the encirclement closed. "Shoot the horses, each man take as much ammunition as he can carry, every man for himself." 4 weeks later, German Army Group Center, the largest German formation on the entire Eastern Front, had effectively ceased to exist. You've probably never heard of Operation Bagration. In the West, it's barely a footnote. D-Day happened 2 weeks earlier, and that's what the history books remember. But Bagration was bigger, more destructive, more decisive, and it proved that the Red Army hadn't just learned to fight, they had mastered it. The offensive launched on June 22, 1944, exactly 3 years after Barbarossa. The Soviets had waited for this anniversary. They wanted the Germans to know. German intelligence was certain the main Soviet blow would fall in Ukraine. They were wrong, catastrophically, fatally wrong. Soviet maskirovka, military deception, reached its peak at Bagration. Fake radio traffic flooded the airwaves. Dummy tanks appeared in Ukraine. False troop movements convinced German commanders to reinforce the wrong sector. Meanwhile, 2.3 million Soviet soldiers quietly massed in Belarus. When the real attack came, Army Group Center had just 400,000 men to face 5 times their number. The front didn't break. It disintegrated. Soviet forces punched through in multiple sectors simultaneously. German divisions were encircled before they could retreat. Communication collapsed. Orders arrived for units that no longer existed. In the first 12 days, the Soviets advanced 200 kilometers. 17 German generals were killed or captured in the first 2 weeks. 27 divisions were destroyed. 19 disbanded entirely because there was nothing left to rebuild. 300,000 German soldiers killed, wounded, or captured in less than a month. More than Stalingrad, in half the time. Minsk fell on July 3rd. Soviet forces paraded 57,000 German prisoners through the streets of Moscow, then hosed down the roads behind them. By August, the Red Army stood at the borders of East Prussia and Poland. Operation Bagration opened the road to Berlin. It shattered Germany's ability to defend in the East. And yet in the West, almost no one knows it happened. Stalingrad got the fame. Bagration delivered the killing blow. The German army was now in free fall. There was no front to stabilize, no reserves to deploy, no miracle weapons to save them. Only retreat, collapse, and the final reckoning waiting in a ruined city 500 kilometers to the west. Battle of Berlin, total collapse. A young German soldier lay under a birch tree, intestines spilling from his stomach, screaming, "Somebody shoot me! Somebody shoot me!" No one did. There was no one left who could. He was one of at least 3,000 child soldiers who fought in the final defense of Berlin. Some were as young as 12. By April 1945, the Third Reich had shrunk to a narrow strip of rubble through central Germany. Hitler retreated to his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery and issued his final orders. Berlin would be defended to the last man. The last bullet. The last child. The city's defenders included whatever was left. Regular Wehrmacht units depleted to skeletons. Waffen-SS fanatics. Elderly Volkssturm militiamen armed with World War I rifles. Hitler Youth boys carrying Panzerfausts heavier than they were. Against them came 2.5 million Soviet soldiers, 6,250 tanks, 41,000 artillery pieces, the largest concentration of firepower ever assembled for a single battle. On April 16th, Marshal Zhukov's forces hit the Silo Heights, the last major defensive line before Berlin. Soviet artillery fired so many shells that the ground itself seemed to burn. The Germans fought with suicidal desperation. Soviet casualties were horrendous, tens of thousands in 4 days. But the position fell. By April 25th, Berlin was completely surrounded. What followed was 2 weeks of apocalyptic urban combat. Soviet troops fought street by street, building by building, floor by floor. They used artillery at point-blank range, blasting through walls rather than clearing rooms. German boys with Panzerfausts ambushed tanks from rubble piles and were gunned down seconds later. Entire city blocks were reduced to moonscapes. Mass suicides swept the city. Families killed themselves rather than face the Soviets. Women were particular targets. Soviet soldiers committed widespread sexual violence, a horror inflicted on an estimated tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of German women in the final weeks. On April 30th, Hitler shot himself in his bunker. His body was burned in the garden above. On May 2nd, 2 Soviet sergeants, Meliton Kantaria and Mikhail Yegorov, raised the red flag over the Reichstag. The photograph became the defining image of Soviet victory. The cost of taking Berlin, Approximately 80,000 Soviet soldiers dead in just over 2 weeks. German military and civilian deaths reached at least 125,000. On May 2, 1945, Berlin surrendered. 6 days later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war that began with Barbarossa ended in the rubble of Hitler's capital. Exactly as it had been fought, and with maximum destruction, maximum suffering, and no mercy given by either side. 27 million Soviet dead. Soldiers, civilians, prisoners, children. 27 million. Germany lost over 4 million soldiers on the Eastern Front. Nearly 80% of its total military dead across the entire war. This wasn't a theater of World War II. This was the war. North Africa, Italy, D-Day, they mattered. But the Eastern Front decided everything. The 7 battles we've covered, Barbarossa, Moscow, Leningrad, Stalingrad, Kursk, Bagration, Berlin, tell a single story. The largest, bloodiest, most consequential military campaign in human history. Germany invaded the Soviet Union expecting victory in weeks. 4 years later, the Soviet flag flew over the Reichstag. The Nazis didn't just lose the war, they were ground into dust.